One of the things I love about scripture passages is sometimes the verse or two that comes before or after, the parts that we almost never read and never notice. I love that little bit at the very end of that, right? We're used to the Ten Commandments, right? We can sit there going, yeah, I know what these are. But I love that part at the end, where God has just spoken to the people and the reaction is to say to Moses, don't let God talk to us. And I think, God just did talk to you. They say, don't let God talk to us because we're terrified because it would destroy us, even though God has just spoken to them. It's an interesting little piece. It's kind of like one time I was reading these in church. It was probably a similar, Sunday to this because this is when they show up in the lectionary every few years. And just like today, we didn't read it from the King James Version, which we're all used to, right? We all know the Ten Commandments in the King James, right? They're written with a nasty finger pointing and they all say, thou shalt not, or else, right? We all know that? Good, we don't. Okay. But there's this interesting little piece at the end where the people say, if God talks to us, we'll die. And it's so bizarre because God has just spoken to them. And perhaps part of the tension with it is we think we know what God is going to say to us. We think we know how God is going to talk to us, and it just isn't what God does. See, the other time when we read these in church, not from the King James Version, someone came up to me afterwards and said, I don't like those. And I thought, there's another sermon. Do we like the Ten Commandments? But that's not what she meant. What she meant was she preferred them in the King James Version because that's what she was used to. I understand that. Well, we had some good conversation around it, but what she liked about it was she really liked the directness of those you shall not. And she frankly kind of liked the, subliminal finger pointing in them. I think when we hear those, we, like the people of Israel, think these are horrible, mean rules from God who will destroy us. But that's not how they start, and it's not really how they're written. I love how the Ten Commandments start, and we usually miss that part as well, right? God said, okay, folks, I'm the God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. That's how they begin. They begin with God saying, okay, I am the God who's been nice to you. I did something amazingly kind for you. I am God of justice and compassion. I could have left you there. You were getting 3 meals a day, as you've liked to remind me since you've been wandering through the desert. You had all the water you could drink, as you liked to remind me as you've been wandering through the desert. You have never missed an opportunity, God kind of implies, to remind me that life was way better back in slavery. But it wasn't. And I've brought you out of that. And because of that, this is how I want you to live. That's how the Ten Commandments begin. So it's an interesting setup, isn't it? It's God saying, I'm nice. The people hear them, and at the end, their panic is, ah! But there's no reason for that at all. It's what we've done to them. See, the Ten Commandments have a terrible translation problem, but it's not from the Hebrew to the English. It's from the English to the English. It's 400 years ago, in the days of the King James Bible, to say thou shalt not was not to make a commandment. It wasn't. It was a pretty good translation of the Hebrew. Problem is, that's how we heard it, and so that's what it's become in English. What these say in Hebrew basically is, you're not going to... So, for example, you're not going to kill. You're not going to steal. You're not going to want everything that everybody else has. That's very different, isn't it? They're very different than the way we've so often heard them. Because these are the words that come to us from a God who said, hey, I'm a nice guy. I rescued you out of terrible, terrible conditions because my concern for you is a compassionate concern. My desire for you is that life goes well. We tend not to hear that. We tend to see one of those pictures of God with the big white beard and the lightning bolt, or the very mean look, staring down from the clouds going, ha, 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 I just can't wait. One of you steps this far out of line, I get to zap you. But let's be honest, is that really, really the image of God, first of all, that we want? But more importantly, is that the image of God that the Bible gives us? It is not. It is not. It's an image we think is in there, but it's just not there. We look for it. We like to put it in there. I think, frankly, that's one of the reasons why people love the Ten Commandments, as we've called them in modern English. The Ten Commandments, why people like them in the King James, because they like that sense of, gotcha. It's very different to hear God saying, this is how it's going to be. This is how you're going to live. This is what I want you to do. Not this is what I'm going to make you do. This is what I want you to do. One of my favorite writers, so many things, give away my age. One of my favorite writers is Kurt Vonnegut. As we discovered at the 8:30 service, there is a generation gap between those of us who are of an age where we read Kurt Vonnegut novels when we were younger, and those who are younger than us who don't know who the heck he was. But for those who are my age and older, perhaps you read Kurt Vonnegut too. Kurt Vonnegut was a very shoot-from-the-hip kind of writer. So some people really love his books, other people not so much. But my favorite of all of his books was the last book that he wrote, and he never completed it. It was sort of his memoirs. And it's just a lot of his thoughts and reflections on a variety of things. And one of the things that was interesting is through all of those novels, some of which were, let's face it, pretty raunchy at times, Kurt Vonnegut was a very devoted Christian, just a different kind of Christian than, as he put it, you would find in most churches. And he did a wonderful thing in his memoirs where he said, I don't understand. I'm paraphrasing and cleaning it up a little, by the way. But he says basically, I don't understand why people like to put the Ten Commandments in courtrooms and places like that. I think they're dumb. And why are we quoting the Old Testament? Why don't we quote Jesus? Wouldn't it be great to put a saying of Jesus's up on the wall? But let's face it, who wants to put blessed are the peacemakers in the halls of Congress? Yeah, right. We would much rather quote something that we think is God being mean and threatening than we would to quote, love God, love one another, which is what Jesus really did with these words, simply to condense them. It's kind of like you can say to a child, don't be mean to your sister, or be nice to your sister. It's essentially the same thing. But instead of thinking, okay, I shouldn't be mean, I should be nice, we try and quibble over the words, because we'd much rather quibble over the words than be nice to our sister. I can testify to that. It's much easier to get caught up in arguing about English. It's much easier to try and point fingers than it is to try and live in God's way. And that's what these words are about. They're not threats. They're not even rules. They're God saying, okay, folks, the old ways haven't worked so hot. So we're going into the promised land here. When we get to the promised land, I'd like to give you a few guidelines. I'd like you to try and live my way, God says. I'd like you to try and live God's way, because living your own way, not working so well. God's way, you don't kill each other, you don't steal from each other, you don't cheat and lie and run around and be sneaky. You don't spend your time trying to figure out how to get what somebody else has. You take care of your parents because, and this was simply a reality in the pre-healthcare days, they're old and they can't see and they can't hear and they're pretty weak and incapable of caring for themselves. So it's an incredible rule. It's not really God saying something about how to care for your parents. It's God saying, look out for those people who are worse off than you, who don't have and who can't do. Take care of them. You'll have a better life because you'll feel better about yourself. God does not say to us, this is what you're going to do, or else. God says, this is what you're going to do, full stop. And that makes it far more difficult. It's like the loving God, loving your neighbor stuff that Jesus talks about. How do you really do that, right? It's difficult. It's a challenge. God knows that. God gives us a challenge. God gives us words that we're supposed to struggle with. Not just slap up on the wall of some courtroom, as an example, and hope that somehow they trickle down and change things, because, by the way, they don't. Not to threaten us, not to tell us what we have to do, but to tell us what we ought to do. Because when we do it, when we really try and live in God's way, when we really try and do things a little differently than yesterday, tomorrow turns out better. And that's what God is talking to us about here. So whenever we hear the Ten Commandments, in any version, whenever we see them, heavens knows they appear in a lot of art. And frankly, in some places you can find them in a courtroom, you can find them on stones in parks, you can find them in all sorts of places. Don't see them as rules that are threatening. Don't see them as something to take and hit someone over the head with. See them as an invitation from God to move away from living in an atmosphere of fear, of terror, of anger, of finger pointing, to move into a tomorrow of caring and loving and trying. That's what God wants from us. Amen.